I first met Ray over 20 years ago, just after his 99th birthday. After a couple of hours with him, I was hooked. Okay, one thing led to another, more interviews, a guest curation gig for his 100th birthday retrospective, a journal article, then finally a book. For the 2 years I interviewed him, a pattern developed. I would spend 3 or 4 days taping, then return home and transcribe. Notable names, dates, and activities became clues used to dig deeper into archival research about Ray. Finer details emerged, which formed a new round of questions for my next visit with Ray. Despite advanced age and physical limitations, Ray absolutely fascinated me. He had lively recall of decades-old events in his life, which spanned the bulk of the 20th century. I learned how Ray fit in and sometimes did not fit in across time as turbulent events in American art history unfolded. By the time I tackled my book project, I had mountains of data to deal with, almost too much. Though most came from Ray and his wife Betty's children, Tim and Barbara, many others in the Strong clan shared their files and images of their paintings. For the current exhibition, half of what you see on display came from them, along with many more illustrating my talk this afternoon. I am indebted to the entire Strong family for their help, hospitality, and friendship over the years, and especially with this Northern California retrospective. This is where Ray was born, 1905, Corvallis, Oregon. And I should mention too, at the time, his father, H.W. Strong, was studying at Stanford and for a law degree. And with his degree in hand, he moved to Portland and started his work as an attorney. Yeah, so, and I should say, these are the Strong boys as of about 1910. And I'm kind of gauging that on Winston's age right here, about 2. And you can see too, I've got it on good word that these Strong boys were the inspiration for the Little Rascals series that came a few years later. So going from tallest to shortest, you have Ed Strong, then Hillman Strong. Ray is the one with the askewed cap, and then Winston. And these are more photos. This is, again, Ray right here, Winston. And there's the parents. That's H.W. and wife Ethel. And they're kind of mingling with friends here, but you can see Ray is right here holding a train. So this was near the Willamette River in the Brooklyn neighborhood. It's actually about a mile from my gallery in Portland, too. Yeah, this is the earliest known piece of artwork by Ray Strong. And it survived thanks to Ray's sister, Ethel. And the background on this is that Ray's mother was taking art lessons, mainly in decorating ceramics, in Portland from an artist named Mamie Parvin Brown. And she would bring, starting with Ed, she would bring him in for classes, then Hillman, and then Ray. And it was apparent to the parents that Ray was actually starting to show a little bit of talent. Okay, so we're kind of moving into the World War I years. And so this picture, there are some Strongs here. And let's see, that is Ed. there's Ray, and that guy is Hillman. And so, they were in the YMCA summer camp they hiked up to Mount St. Helens this particular year. The following year, 1918, if you want to advance, those YMCA boys were picking strawberries kind of out in the gorge past Hood River. And after they kind of finished with all that, they took a break and hiked up Eagle Creek, which is a creek that runs into the Columbia River. And this little spot right here and the falls, it's known as, actually they scrubbed more recently Devils from Punch Bowl Falls because there's another one at the coast. But back in these days, it was Devil's Punch Bowl Falls. And what happened here was I think a profound tragedy that affected Ray for the rest of his life. So during the time that they were hiking, there was a huge log right across the top of the falls. And Ray had kind of hiked up in here. He was a climber, and that's probably why his knees gave out later in life. But he was way above here, and Hillman was down here on the log with his camera trying to get a photograph of a porcupine. Well, the porcupine startled him, and he fell over the falls, and he did not come up. And Ray saw the whole thing. As a matter of fact, I read reports in the papers that showed that his body was not found for over a week. So another little interesting career shift occurred just after that, in 1918, when H.W. Strong, the attorney, and it's kind of a long story that I explain in my book, but Ray's father, essentially worked out a deal to run a berry farm in Gresham, which is about 12 miles east of Portland. He attempted to maintain his law practice and run the berry farm, and soon discovered that in spite of his typical boundless, strong energy, couldn't do it. So he gave up his attorney's practice and started managing the farm. So when all of the kids got old enough, they were all assigned jobs on the farm. So Ray, if you want to go to the next slide, and I should say too, it's a little bit more rustic out there. The further east you went, you were kind of up on Mount Hood. And here is, and I've always found this photograph kind of interesting because he's got a huge salmon right here, and then he's got a gun under his arm. And I'm not imagining that he was shooting fish in a barrel or anything like that. But anyway, the Strong boys loved it out there. It was really great rural environment for them. So Ray's job, when he got old enough, was he was assigned the trucking duties. And here, that's Ray at the wheel. And these are migrant farm workers. You'll notice too that back in these days, most of these migrant farm workers were white too. So now the Strong boys got along pretty well with them. They played sports with them, baseball, and they were treated very well. And they had encampments right, during harvest time on the property. Now, probably Ray's first important mentor in art was this gentleman, Clyde Leon Keller, who is known as probably one of our top Impressionist painters. I would say, when I'm saying known as ours, it's Oregon's. And now one of the things that H.W. Strong wanted in all his kids, good education, good jobs, and and he saw Ray kind of drifting into art, and he had some worries about that because he knew that the life of an artist was often a financially challenging one. So he happened to stop by at Keller's shop in Portland and saw that Keller, in addition to being an accomplished painter, also ran a very successful framing business. And H.W. kind of thought, I think this might work, something like this for Ray as an example. And so for $5 a Sunday, Keller and Ray painted. And this was in the early 20s while Ray was in high school. And the benefit to Keller was that Keller did not drive. And as I mentioned, that was Ray's gig on the farm. He was, a driver, so he would drive. And this delighted Keller because Keller had better range. And I found out subsequently that after Ray moved on, that Keller hooked up with other painters that drove. So, yeah. Now, this is a painting that turned up in my gallery a few years ago. And when I was first researching Ray, I understood that in Gresham at their high school, Ray had given a painting of Crater Lake as a class gift to Gresham High. And so I went to the school, and they had no record of it. They let me look through the whole school, even in their storage areas. No clue. And then it showed up, and it's kind of hard to see, but it's dated 1923. So,
where did it show up?
in California.
Wow.
And what threw me is it was in its original frame, papered over on the back. And I always pay attention to what's on the back of paintings and the back of frames. And it had a label from an old label from a framer in Sacramento. And I thought, well, that's not really adding up. And then I noticed that there was some other paper underneath, and so I carefully soaked off the backing paper, and there underneath was a Keller the Art Man sticker on the frame. So it connected it right back. This is another very recent discovery. Actually, earlier this year, this watercolor, and it's unsigned, but I was contacted by a woman who, their family has lived in the Gresham area for, generations. And it was all very neatly inscribed on the back, but the watercolor belonged to her grandfather, who was a high school chum of Ray's. And while I don't know exactly when it was painted, I'm suspecting probably about 1924, since they wrote 1924 on the back. So, but anyway, I mean, it's amazing the things that continue to turn up. And just as an aside with the exhibition, there are things that have turned up since I wrote the book that I find very exciting that you'll be able to see out there. Now, this is a painting that somehow I missed at Ray Strong's son, Tim's shed, just down the road here in Clear Lake area. And I'm fairly certain that it's from his high school years. It probably depicts the farm. It's a very rural environment here. And I wish it had turned up. I would have put it in the book. It's a really poetic painting, I think. It's very dirty too, so it's going to look a lot better, I think, once it's conserved. And this is Ray in high school. This photograph was actually used in one of his high school yearbooks, and it shows kind of the plein air aesthetic. Ray sitting in the snow painting while probably one of his brothers is skiing over here. Okay. This is also from Ray's senior high school yearbook. And I should mention too, for those of you that are not family and want to learn more about Ray's personality, he was kind of the opposite you would think of as an artist. He was definitely not the kind of guy that was going to pine and cut off part of his ear. He was extroverted, active. He was a ball of energy, going all the time, in many different directions sometimes. But here he is, right in the middle. Obviously, somewhat of a comedic performance, which seems to fit. Okay, I need to talk a little bit more about this painting. And this was also painted in 1924. When I was trying to figure out how Ray got to California, the family was very helpful in giving me all the important details. And at the time, in 1924, when Ray graduated from high school, his brother was coming back up to Oregon for the summer, and he brought along his friend, Norton Brown. Norton Brown was the son of Ed Strong's favorite philosophy professor at Stanford. And one of the things that Norton Brown noticed about Ray is that he'd work on the farm all day long, and then in the evening, he would go off somewhere and paint. And so Ray invited Norton to come along painting with him, and he just said, you want to come painting up on Mount Hood? We've got a full moon, the time is right, let's go up there. So they drove all the way up to Paradise Park, and Ray painted a scene. If this is not, I'm pretty sure, I'm about 95% sure this is the painting. But Norton Brown was astounded. Now, at the time, Ray was registered to attend the University of Oregon. He didn't know what he was going to major in, and he still wanted to paint, but he knew one thing: he was going to play basketball. And as I mentioned, he was a very outgoing guy. He was a star athlete. His bases loaded home run secured a state championship for Gresham High. And so anyway, and all the kids were like that. Even Winston with his, polio, played tennis. Yeah. Anyway, so talk started rumbling around in the family. Now, everybody started getting on board with the idea of Ray going to California. Norton had mentioned to him that his aunt was a very accomplished artist, and we'll see a picture of her in a minute. But so Elizabeth Norton, based in Palo Alto, and he said, also there's a really good art school that is actually the oldest art school on the West Coast, California School of Fine Arts, and that he might study there. So the big roadblock to all this was H.W. Strong. And so they presented a unified front, and H.W. was therefore persuaded. And so that is what got Ray down to California. So this is Elizabeth Norton, and she is a well-listed artist, national reputation, and she painted, but what she's best known for is what she's doing right here, color wood block prints, and also a sculptor of good quality work too. Her friend was Hobart Jacobs, who was kind of in California for a while and soon to return to New York. But Ray started painting around the area with both of them, plein air painting. And as a matter of fact, later on when Ray ended up in New York, he ended up painting once again with Hobart Jacobs in the late 20s. So prior to this happening, Ray did enroll at the California School of Fine Arts, and however, he ran into some problems there. And because the school's director, Lee Randolph, was very intent in kind of moving his students into modernism, staying in touch with the times. Well, back in Palo Alto, though, Ray had been painting around the area and exhibited a bunch of those plein air sketches at the Palo Alto Art Club. And this painter right here, Western painter Jimmy Swinnerton, saw some of the work. Now, Swinnerton organized usually a late summer trip to the Grand Canyon with a bunch of other professional painters. For example, the previous year, 1924, Maynard Dixon was on that trip. Well, he talked to Ray, and it was easy enough to talk Ray into going to the Grand Canyon to paint. And of all the painters that were on that trip, Ray really stuck close to Jimmy Swinnerton. So here they are, and I'm just amazed that this photo survived in spite of all the tears and stuff, showing Ray here, getting ready to pack into the Grand Canyon. This is one of his little sketches of the Grand Canyon. And what and just the way my brain works, I want to find out where this is. And I found out that Jimmy Swinnerton was, he usually started off at this place called, there was a Grandview Hotel. It was before the big Grand Canyon complex emerged later, but there was a hotel there, and this was actually a view from that point called Grandview. And much in the plein air tradition, much like you've seen with Monet's haystack paintings, Rouen Cathedral, painted different times of day, different light. Ray painted a lot of times the same location on this trip. When Ray returned to the California School of Fine Arts, he created quite the buzz because he brought a lot of these little oil paintings along with him. And the students were pretty excited about it. And the buzz got around to Lee Randolph, the director of the school, who summoned Ray to his office. And the way Ray put it, he said, Ray, if you keep painting like this, you're going to find yourself 20 years behind the times. Well, that was enough for Ray to just say, see you later. And so he checked out of there, and he knew he needed more education, and he didn't know what to do. And so he simply asked his friend Jimmy Swinnerton, and Jimmy Swinnerton suggested, you need to go to the Art Students League in New York. The whole structure of the school is run by the students, so you don't have to worry about somebody cramming stuff down your throat, and the instruction is top-notch. So this is the instructor that Ray, I think probably one of the two most important mentors for Ray in his art education. And so Ray ended up at the Art Students League. He studied with another teacher there, George Bridgman, but kind of didn't like the way, he was irritated by the fact that Bridgman would come around and start messing around with the students' sketches. And so he had found through a friend he met there that this guy was the guy to study with, Frank Vincent Dumond, who, by the way, married one of his students who was an Oregonian. So he spent a lot of time and had a lot of influence on Oregon painters a couple of decades earlier. So the thing that kind of distinguishes Dumond is that he's really hard to categorize as far as his style. And essentially, Dumond's style was naturalistic and representational. And by that, it meant that he would let nature inspire him and then see what happens. He paid attention to other art movements, and he would pull bits and pieces from Impressionism, from Modernism, and things like that, but never let it dominate what he was doing in his own work. He passed along that, that whole sense of painting to Ray. And one of the things, most notably, is that, Ray was bringing his little Oregon sketches to Dumont for a critique. And Dumont told him that, if you remember some of those earlier paintings, they're kind of soft and there's not a lot of definition, kind of diffuse looking. He said, Ray, I really love the poetry of your little Oregon paintings. He said, but your foregrounds are mush. He said, what I want you to do is squirt pure cadmium orange into that foreground, and that'll force you to lay more definitive brushworks to cover it up. And I've seen that cadmium orange popping, and you see it in some of those paintings out there, that he carried that the rest of his life, essentially. And he is pretty notable for his foregrounds, too. Ray, that is. Okay. So this is after about a year's study with Dumont. Now, unfortunately for Ray, he was a landscape painter. But here he was in the middle of New York. His landscape had to become the immediate urban environment. And you'll see a spectacular painting out here called Hook and Ladder that was painted around the same time. And you'll see too that, maybe not so much in my slide here, but there's a lot of, I wouldn't call it, it's more post-impressionistic in the brushwork, but there's great atmosphere, and his sense of perspective is really great in this. The aerial perspective, going back to purple, is really well done. Plus, all the figures. Ray was learning how to paint figures. So there's some knowing chuckles in the Strong family coming out. So another thing I should probably step back on is that with his friendship with the Norton Brown family, through his brother Ed, he met Norton's younger sister, Betty, and the two of them fell in love. And so when Ray went to New York in 1926, Betty went back with him, and she was an accomplished violinist, classical violinist, and she was studying in New York at the time that Ray was studying at the Art Students League. So Ray finished about a year at the Art Students League, and with that boundless energy that he had, he felt that, okay, I've accomplished everything I need to do. I'm going to go back to Oregon. I'm going to become Oregon's next great landscape painter. And so he quit school, went back to Oregon, and painted. But in the meantime, he also lived out this fantasy to build his and Betty's home. And this was in Brightwood. This is up on Mount Hood. Just before this, H.W. Strong had a small kind of a vacation cabin built, which is still there. And this was built on the property. And actually, I heard later that, unfortunately, Ray didn't pay really close attention to the property lines, and so it was on somebody else's property, too. But anyway, this octagonal house became Ray's studio, and he was so busy building it, he didn't have enough time to go out and sketch, plein air sketch. So he was working up a lot of his existing sketches using this as his studio. Eventually, saner heads in the Strong family prevailed. The most important one being Ed Strong, who pretty much gave it to Ray straight and unvarnished. And I have this, I've quoted entirely this great letter that he wrote to Ray. And he pretty much said that, Ray, your fantasy about becoming this organ painter and getting Betty to live in this house is a fool's errand. Betty hates the house. She doesn't want to live in Oregon. What's in it for her to be a classical violinist in Portland, Oregon? So, at the time. So eventually, it got through Ray's thick skull that he needed to return to New York and finish his art education, which he did. In the meantime, though, this is some of the work that he was painting there. And this painting was, he actually exhibited this painting at the Portland Art Museum. And I talked to the Mazama's mountaineering group in Portland, and they said, this right here is Zigzag Canyon. So, and one of the things about Ray, too, is that he liked heights. He liked elevation. So a lot of his plein air sketching was not from down below, looking up at Mount Hood. It was on Mount Hood, looking at the peak. This is another painting, and it says Estacada Farm. Well, H.W. Strong also, as an adjunct to the Berry Farm down in Estacada, which is a bit of a drive south of Gresham, they had a walnut farm there. And so Ray had to drive his truck down there. And he saw this very quaint scene that's really reminiscent of a lot of the Midwestern scene painters that were painting these kind of things at the time. And so here he is in Gresham painting. No Betty. And this is a professional photograph of Ray. It's taken somewhere kind of in that mid to late 20s era. As you can see, he was quite the handsome dude. So part of the sanity that was restored in Ray's career led him to marry Betty at the date posted. And we're fortunate to have that photograph for you to look at a little bit more in detail. After they finished here, Betty indulged Ray, and so they spent a few days in the octagonal cabin before they moved to New York to continue their studies. It was clear to me throughout my book that probably one of the great benefactors of Ray was his oldest brother, Ed. And Ed, at the time Ray was at the Art Students League, was at Columbia going for a PhD in philosophy. And as it turned out, his favorite philosophy professor there, Woodbridge, had a son, Fritz Woodbridge, who was an architect, and he had just designed a parish hall in Keene Valley, New York, and it was like way upstate, small little town. And so they were looking for somebody to paint murals in this parish hall, and Ed threw Ray's name into the mix, and Ray got that job, and it was a pretty eventful job for Ray. And so he had, he was painting all these urban scenes and, things with people in them. And so he had all of these ideas about, different kinds of scenes within the life of the local town in Keene Valley, with the church and everything. But when he arrived in Keene Valley, which is kind of surrounded by these rolling Appalachian mountains, he tossed those aside and just went out sketching. And so these murals, and I have seen them, actually they just got cleaned not too long ago, are kind of a compilation of Ray's sketches, views from a central point, kind of way up in the air, of all of those hills. Now, the other big thing that happened with Ray was that the pastor of this church was a man by the name of Eric Thompson. He was Danish, and he was, and at that time, in the early 30s, the cooperative movement was very active in Denmark. And Eric Thompson started talking to Ray about cooperation, the cooperative movement. And as a matter of fact, Ray would work all day long painting these murals. He'd come back, they put him up in the parish there. He'd come back and there'd be a book on cooperation on his bed for him to read. So, and he became a longtime friend of that pastor who eventually moved to California. So the other big benefit that occurred too is that Keene Valley had a lot of cottages that were owned by well-to-do people from New York City. And keep in mind too, this is 1931. This is really not a great year in the Depression. But Ray found through Eric Thompson a very welcome clientele. So he had a number of exhibitions there, sold a lot of paintings, and with that money, he and Betty were able to buy a car from one of their friends in Keene Valley and drive all the way back to California. They knew they were going to go back west, and it was just a matter of when and where. So the time was right. They had the money to do it, and the grand plan was arriving in San Francisco and opening an art supply store there. This is an example of one of the plein air paintings that he was doing around the area in Keene Valley. So, Ray and Betty got an apartment way up on Russian Hill in San Francisco, and this was in 1933 when they arrived. Now, right at this time, there were plans in place for a New Deal relief program for artists, and it was called the Public Works of Art Project. And they had enormous funding. It was a 6-month project, and they allocated $1 million for all these artists nationally to paint history paintings that would embellish public buildings. And it was kind of a get back to work kind of program. So this is a picture of Ray painting and you can see he worked on pretty large scale too. He was a fast painter. He kind of got that from Keller, I think. But this is the Golden Gate Bridge under construction. You're kind of looking north to the Marin Headlands right here. And anyway, this is the final result. We have one of the studies in our exhibition, and you can, and in my book, on facing pages, I have the final painting and this study. So you can see the kind of revisions that Ray made to the final composition. Probably most notably, he loved this red tower over the North Tower here. But there was, and you'll see in the study over there, that there was a crane here, and it went all the way up and kind of obscured it. So, artistic license, he just chopped it off. And he centered the cable well, I'm not sure what they're called. They're for holding the cables down, anchoring them, cable anchors. And he got more sky into it, and he made a little bit more room over here for this big ship coming into the bay. This particular painting was, I consider it to be probably Ray's most famous painting. It was selected when the project was finished in mid-1934. Ray's painting was selected along with a number of others to be exhibited at the Corcoran Gallery in Washington, D.C. And it was a testament to, good things happening in America, getting back on its feet. This painting was, along with some others, was selected by FDR and his wife Eleanor Roosevelt to hang in the White House. So it was in the White House during Roosevelt's administration. This is another painting right from that same project. It's an easel painting. And it's probably painted very close to where they were living. Probably the most notable landmark is the old Spanish church right here. And also showing Ray's mastery of perspective. It's in some respects, a very abstract looking painting to me. Also, as that Public Works of Art project was winding down, Ray was finishing up a big library mural for the San Jose Junior High School. And the students, you could see, Ray was very, even when I knew him at 99 and 100 years old, he was very charming. The students fell in love with Ray, and I'm sure he was bantering with them in the school. And they loved the work so much, they insisted that he do another painting for them. But this time, they wanted him to do something of his own design. So he pretty much pulled out all the stops, and he made this large portable mural, and it's about 13 feet across. And it's a lot of the philosophy involved here. He got from Eric Thompson, the cooperative movement. And probably the short way of describing the cooperative movement at this time and the way Ray was treating it, because he got very involved. He was actually touring the state of California, lecturing on it, in the midst of all the other artwork that he was doing. But what they like to say was that cooperation was the middle ground between capitalism and socialism. So in other words, not either of those polar extremes, but a blend of what was best of both. And so you can see, obviously, this side is a side of war. And it was 1934, so a lot of the war imagery was taken from World War I. So a couple of things I'll throw out. There's a lot of imagery in here, but I will tell you this. Ray, he explained to me a lot of the imagery and background, like these figures here. This first one is fear. This one with the newspaper is propaganda. And this one here is war armaments. And his model for this was Winston Strong, one of his younger brothers. And so, in essence, Winston just simply got these big wool blankets and pulled them over his head, and Ray did the rest. Also, you'll see up here these hands with claws that are dug into the earth. These scales are gold coins here. So, and then there's, of course, the obligatory burned out cities, death, and a field of skulls. Go to the next one. So this is the middle, and there's a shift that goes on as people are moving toward this side. So there are people that are wounded, that are healing. And also too, this is a pre-woke rainbow right here. So, but anyway, that there's enough food, this cornucopia with all the food coming out, farmlands for everybody. And rising up to this heroic figure up here, who is Ray Strong. And you can see too, there's technology, beautiful cities, dirigible in the sky. Yeah, and I think also he painted his mother into the scene very appropriately. Also, and below here too, it's kind of hard to see with all the figures, but this is sort of the manufacturing going on here. It's like probably a foundry or something. Anyway, Ray had given this mural to the school, and he told me that the kids raised money for doing paper drives and so forth to pay for his regular PWAP wages. I dug into the National Archives, and what I found was that was partially true, actually 1/3 true, because that $1 million was running out from the federal government. There were California relief funds that came into play. So it essentially went 1/3 PWAP, 1/3 paper drives and fundraising, and then another third California emergency funds. And so this painting was portable, and Ray kept getting requests to borrow it. And so he'd come down to the school and say, well, I'm going to borrow it again. And then finally, after the last time it was loaned, which was to the Golden Gate International Exposition on Treasure Island, where it was in the Women's Peace Project building. And it was the centerpiece, and it's where it got this name, the choice, when Berkeley's mayor at the time, with a big crowd around him, studied this mural and exclaimed, well, that's the choice. So that stuck. But what happened with this mural is that the principal of the school just came to Ray and said, Ray, you keep borrowing this mural. Maybe it's a lot more important than hanging in the lower lobby of our junior high school. And so they worked out a trade, and Ray gave him 3 large oil paintings, and then Ray got the mural back. And so it stayed in his estate, and eventually, and it was rolled up, and there was damage to it, but it got laid down on a panel, and eventually, through the family, we arranged to have it donated to Pacific University in Forest Grove, Oregon. And there are Strongs who have seen it in person, right, Diana? Yeah, on our Ray Strong road trip. So, okay. Now, part of Ray's art complex was not just an art supply store. Eventually, they opened an Art Students League of San Francisco, and that was made possible when they were able to recruit Maynard Dixon as the main instructor. So there was a crew of them, plus they had a photography school that was part of it that had some obscure photographers like Ansel Adams and Dorothea Lange teaching. So they also opened a gallery, so they were exhibiting work. So they were kind of the hotbed of art activity right there in the kind of mid to late 30s. But this was used as peace and war for Ray's talking points for cooperation. And one of the things too is that this section some of the damage was in this section of the painting, so a lot of that's been kind of painted out in the mural as it exists today. Well, in the following year, Ray did his first diorama backgrounds. This one was for the U.S. Forest Service, and it was for the California Pacific International Exposition in San Diego. So there was a series of these. Ray did all the backgrounds. This particular one has to do with the Ponderosa Way, which was, I think, an 800-mile-long fire break through the mountains of California and into Oregon. And you'll notice, too, just quite coincidentally, we have on loan a painting of a fire break out in our exhibition. And so this job with the Forest Service lasted quite a bit longer, and there was a pattern that developed. One thing kind of led to the other, and Ray got referred to the National Park Service, too. But this is the Art Students League. I just wanted to show you what their brochure looked like. And this was kind of their logo right here. I'm not sure where they drew that from or whose design that was. And you'll see here it says, Artists and Students Associated in Cooperative Groups. Toward the late 30s, Ray did other WPA works. There's an alphabet soup list of different projects beyond the Public Work of Art project. There was one called TRAP, it was like the Treasury art project, and there was the section of Fine Arts and Sculpture. But a lot of what they were doing was they wanted to have major murals go up into public buildings. Now, these were usually assigned based on competition. And so Ray, with his fellow instructor, Maynard Dixon, submitted sketches to a number of new post offices. I know there was one in Merced, one in Modesto, and they didn't get the work. Now, even though they said these were based on competition, the assigning of the artist to the post office wasn't always the case. Sometimes somebody who came in second had very good work too, and so they would just say, okay, we got this other one going in, you get it. And that was the case with this particular mural. And you'll notice the style is quite a bit different. And when Ray was assigned this project, he asked the officials if Maynard Dixon could help him do it, and they said, no, Ray, we'd just like you to do it on your own. So he did it in a style that Maynard Dixon had been experimenting with for probably about 15 years, and it's kind of an American offshoot of Cubism known as Precisionism. So essentially, what you would do was you would use a lot of geometric stylization, a lot of flat planes of color. And now the whole thing isn't done that way, but he felt it was appropriate to do the mountains that way. And so what this mural depicts here is, this is the first land crossing by Jedediah Smith. And this is Smith down here with his hardy troops. And obviously, too, it was the first, let's clarify a little bit. It was the first land crossing into California by white people. So, yeah, the next one is a little bit more in Ray's style. And this was a job that he got in Decatur, Texas, and a little bit more of not with the Maynard Dixon stylization. But I love the clouds in this. Ray was a great cloud painter. And actually, Ray and Betty drove all the way out to Decatur, Texas, and Ray installed the mural by himself, too. so I mentioned that, Ray was developing some notoriety as a diorama painter. And so word got out, since he was working for the Forest Service in Berkeley at the time. They had left San Francisco. Ray pretty much shut down his art shop, school, and everything else, mostly because they could not compete with federally funded WPA art centers. Students could go in, get materials, supplies, and instruction free of charge. And so they closed that up, and Ray and Betty moved to Berkeley right around 1938. So he was right near UC Berkeley, and they were preparing an exhibit, and this was through the, you'll see up here, the paleontology department of UC Berkeley. And it was called Science in the Service of Man. And so it essentially showed dioramas through the ages, essentially a lot of dinosaur exhibits. And I was fortunate to work with somebody he's retired from Berkeley now, but he worked in the department. And I should kind of back up and say that when Ray was doing these diorama backgrounds, there was also foreground modeling that had to be done. There were figures that had to be sculpted. And it was there that Ray met his longtime friend, William Gordon Huff, who did a lot of the sculptures of the dinosaurs in these dioramas. And this particular one was one of two that survived that I was able to get a photograph of before they were destroyed. So this is David Smith, and this is kind of what they looked like. And they were in rough shape too, but it was totally cool to be able to see them in person after all those years. So this is Bill Huff, and this large sculpture that he's working on, he did some huge sculptures for the Golden Gate International Exposition too. I think a lot of the large figures that were outside of the buildings and so forth. And this was done just a year before he met Ray in Berkeley. This is Chief Solano. As you can see, it's a pretty big one. He's kind of up on a scaffold there. Okay, so as part of the national parks projects, and I should say too that they were very helpful in giving me leads to find these archival photographs. So this is in the White Sands National Monument, and a few years ago I heard that they were I haven't checked it out lately, but I heard that they were reinstalling these big dioramas that Ray is working on right here. And what he's doing right here is the painting is already done, and he's kind of working in what's called the tie-in, which is the blend from the foreground elements into the painting to try to make it as seamless as possible. So you may have noticed these two out in the exhibition hall. And I was astounded to find out that, and you can see right at the top here that these are curved on the ends. Ray actually painted these murals on paper, oil on paper. And it became a big mystery that we were trying to track down, especially because the Tim Strong part of the family has a cabin up at Lassen, and we had gone back and forth trying to figure out what happened to them. Well, they magically appeared, all conserved like you see them out there. The diorama enclosure is gone, but the paintings were very carefully and professionally conserved and remounted. And they turned up at the Turtle Bay Exploration Park in Reading. And when they arrived here, and I came in the other day, I saw them for the first time. They were all wrapped up and in crates. And they just simply knocked me out. But does anybody notice when you're looking at those, anything funny about them? Yeah, it's because one is actually a mirror opposite of the other. So, and it's the one of Mount Lassen after eruption that was painted mirror opposite. And I'm not sure exactly how they did the diorama enclosure, but the Park Service notes called it an illusion box. So what they had was, they had the mural, which was the before mural. You'd see that, and then you'd flip a toggle switch, a light would come on and reflect the after mural in its place. So you could kind of go back and forth and do that. So that's why Ray has these things lined up the way he needed to do. So one would look kind of like a mirror opposite of the other, even though the actual, colors and everything, because it was after a big eruption. Ray continued to work with Bill Huff on a number of projects. They found that they worked well together, they were good friends, and they decided to market their skills. And so they sent letters out to institutions all over California, kind of talking about building exhibits. And they got lucky, and the Palo Alto Junior Museum hired them to create a whole science wing for their museum. And so that included dioramas, sculptures, and they kind of went with the same theme of evolution. But Ray also did a lot of these wonderful panels. He would show, like this particular one, shows essentially the same landscape through every month of the year. So it kind of shows how colors change, how light changes, and all that. He also did some that show different times of day and so forth. So that, and I should say too, that wing was dismantled. I think it was back in the 70s. And they gave Ray a call because, while they kept some of their pieces, they wanted to let go of others. And Ray retrieved them, and a lot of those got donated to the Santa Barbara Natural History Museum. So, and this is a similar sort of panel Ray did for producer cooperation. As I mentioned, he lectured all over the state doing this sort of thing. Now, you may have noticed out there's a painting in the corner of kind of an expanded view of this, but this is a study done much earlier, right around 1940, whereas that one out there was done about 1969. And it had to do with, I showed that, that scene in the Devil's Punch Bowl where Hillmanstrong lost his life. Ray had a dream. He was painting out in the Bishop area, and he had a porcupine scurry across his camp in the middle of the night. He fell asleep, and he had this dream about Hillman. He woke up the next day, and he painted this painting. And this is kind of a typical West Marin County painting, Black Mountain, kind of, I think, Ray's favorite signature subject, painted right as the war was ending. This is Maynard Dixon. In 1946, Maynard Dixon was very ill, and this is his wife, Edith Hamlin, also a very accomplished artist in her own right, and quite a bit younger than Maynard. But they lived in Tucson, and Maynard was really concerned about, because he had emphysema, he was a chain smoker, and he was dying. He was on oxygen 24/7. But he got a commission that was going to pay some money, which he thought would support his wife after he died. And Ray was one of two painters that joined Edith Hamlin to actually paint this long mural of the Grand Canyon, of which Ray was very familiar with. That particular year, 1946, is a pretty key year. Ray painted throughout the Southwest, and you'll see a number of paintings in the exhibition that were painted, while he was in Tucson and on his way back. And this is one painted in Tucson, and it has, to me, it's, the layers of clouds in the sky, the sun setting, almost a metaphor for watching his friend dying. And he did die, it was after Ray left Tucson, but it was on the drive back that he read about it. Same year, he went to Zion and painted there. And this painting is a knockout to me, just the wonderful colors in it. Lots of power in that. And also kind of has a Maynard Dixon kind of feel to it. Ray moved to Mill Valley in 1948, and this is H.W. Strong helping him build his house. Now, Ray was in a crib in their house in Palo Alto when the 1906 earthquake hit. And the family story is that Ray's crib kind of walked across the room and banged against the wall, and Ray never woke up. But anyway, you can see by the size of these floor joists here that H.W., I think, having experienced that earthquake, really encouraged Ray to overbuild. And so, after all, they did build the house, on the slopes of a volcano. So, another job Ray got in the 50s was for the California Academy of Sciences. And this is for the Greater Kudu exhibit. And so Ray way up on scaffolding, painting this. We're not sure exactly what became of this exhibit. It was kind of in one big hall that I think got decommissioned. And this is another powerful painting Ray did in the 50s, the Big Sur Coast. And this painting this photograph here was taken by Ansel Adams, and this is the inside of that home that was under construction a couple of slides ago. And you'll see right here on the edge is just the edge of a painting. If you go to the next slide, we have the painting. So you'll just see that part of it in the photograph. And that is Mendocino City. And that became kind of a touch point for Ray as far as subject matter, painting Mendocino area. They had a long camping trip that I heard a lot about from Tim Strong, Ray's son. At the end of the decade, Ray and Betty and their daughter Barbara, who was, I think, 13 at the time, embarked on a painting trip through Europe. And they left in October to paint throughout Europe. They bought a car, an Opel, and drove around. And this is one of the early paintings that they painted there. Now, they had ended up in central Italy, and as I mentioned, they headed out in October, so by this time was November, and there were torrential downpours that particular year. I think Ray hadn't really figured on the weather being such as it was. And so they made a decision not to paint to the south of Italy and instead head back up through the French Riviera and back to Paris. And as they were driving back, they were getting more and more tired, couldn't find a hotel, and the rain was bucketing down. And they found a hotel in a little town called Fréjus. And a disaster occurred there They were saved, but in the middle of the night, the dam broke above the town, and resulting in over 400 deaths. A lot of bodies were washed out to sea. The Strongs were actually saved because of the bus station just above the hotel that had a big retaining wall. So that's what protected them. Ray sketched this sketch. It was another water disaster, much like with Hillman, just showing a lot of abstract forms, kind of ghoulish forms, screaming birds and all that. And he had this little pencil sketch tucked away for a long time, well, about 10 years. When they got back, a planned exhibition of his work did not happen in New York. So he was able to secure a job in Santa Barbara, and they ended up moving to Santa Barbara. And that's kind of in a way, kind of the end point of our exhibition, because he's now officially not in Northern California anymore. But this is a diorama. These are spectacular dioramas, if you have not seen them yet, at the Santa Barbara Natural History Museum. Some of them are really big, too. And this is Ray painting one of them. And here he is. This is the same one, and he's just painting the tie-ins again. In 1969, there was an oil spill in Santa Barbara. And that reawakened that same recurring dream. And Ray still had that study that he had done around 1940. And so one of the things that he did to kind of commemorate the disaster was to go back and paint this painting some 30 years after the first one. And this is in the exhibit, of course. Another thing that he did was he took that pencil sketch, and with the help of another couple of artists in Santa Barbara, they created this huge 4-panel mural that they called the Get Oil Out mural. So it was more activism, environmental activism on the part of Ray with this, except what he did was they added some other little elements. I think if you look, you kind of see I think it's Anacapa Island over here, and there's some oil derricks kind of tucked in here and there too. And this was a really treat being able to see this around the time of that first exhibition that I was part of back in 2004-05. And here's Ray, 1985, with a big painting. And at this time, Ray had collaborated with Arturo Teo, and they formed a group called the Oak Group, still in existence today, with evolving membership. And a lot of what their thesis was taking money that they got from the proceeds of selling paintings at their exhibitions and funding groups like the Natural Conservancy and other groups that would protect lands that they liked to paint on. And this is Ray in the 1990s. And you can see, too, still working pretty large scale here. The rule of thumb with painting, plein air painting is that you want to get most everything down on your painting within a 2-hour span, because then the light changes too appreciably by then. We took Ray on this trip. It was a bucket list trip. Ray had never been to Steens Mountain in eastern Oregon, southeastern Oregon. And so here he is at 100 years old on the edge of Kiger Gorge, sketching. And looks a little precarious, doesn't it? Well, and that's because Ray's nephew, John Adams, was around this time, he was Ray's chauffeur. And Ray wanted to get up close to the East Rim on top of Steens Mountain. And this is the Alvord Desert down in here. And, you know, I know Diane and I had some thoughts, you know, like John, he's a little too close and it's kind of a downward slope. And are you sure the brake on his wheelchair is really, you know, but Ray didn't care at all. And he loved being up there and just seeing the expanse. And there's Ray in mid 1920s. Thank you.